We began a new section of the course, which is looking at different cultures throughout time and space. How have different societies interacted with their environments, managed their resources, and has it been sustainable or not? What can we learn from these different case studies, these different societies throughout space and time in terms of sustainability? Environmental degradation is not an inevitable or natural outcome of human populations. It's a result of specific sociocultural organizations. We'll look at another example of a different type of society in Bali, Indonesia, something called rice-based polyculture. So there's two paths to agricultural intensification. The first we've already looked at. This is represented by the classic Maya, specialization and hierarchy. The other path to agricultural intensification, producing more food to feed more people, is known as smallholders. And this is sort of what the Maya shifted towards after the so-called collapse. These self-sufficient households that practice permanent, intensive, or diversified agriculture. They practice different types of farming, but it's not this centralized hierarchical farming system. It's sort of self-sufficient households and regions farming for themselves and their own needs. And the classic example I have of smallholders for you, which we'll talk about for the rest of this lecture, is something called rice-based polyculture. And so the next example we'll look at of societies throughout time and space and how sustainable they have or have not been is in Bali, Indonesia, specifically looking at rice-based polyculture. And it's an example of a long-term, extremely productive and extremely sustainable farming system. Again, what can we learn from other groups of people? The way we're doing things in our culture isn't set in stone. It's not inevitable. It's a result of choices. And that means it can also be done differently and more sustainably. So what is rice-based polyculture? So polyculture is in contrast to monoculture. Remember monoculture, growing one or two species essentially for sale on the market. It relies on specialized seed and also chemical inputs and fertilizer. Polyculture, in contrast, think poly, many, so you're growing multiple crops in the same space rather than just one monoculture. So in rice-based polyculture, they grow rice, but also other crops. And in this way, polyculture is an imitation of the diversity we find in natural ecosystems. It avoids these large stands of single crops like wheat or corn that are really susceptible to pests and ecological fluctuations. So there's advantages to polyculture in contrast to monoculture. Two specifically ones I want to talk about. First, this biodiversity that's created by polyculture, it lowers the susceptibility of the crops to disease and pests. So think about it. In monoculture, you have one species, one large standing of just one species. It's very susceptible to the pests that feed off of it. It provides a perfect breeding ground for these pests to flourish. Similar, actually, to the flu or even coronavirus among the human populations. And so with the flu, when the flu emerges each year among human populations, some people have immunity to it and some don't. And so some of the people will be affected by the flu bug, but not everyone. In contrast with the coronavirus, it's novel. No one has ever been exposed to it, and therefore no one has immunity to it. And so when you introduce coronavirus into the human population, all humans are identical in the sense that no one has any immunity to it. All are equally susceptible, and it's really, really easy for the virus to then spread through the population, through all these hosts that have no immunity. So in the same way, in ecosystems, when they're naturally diverse or when polyculture occurs in contrast to monoculture, it lowers the plant's susceptibility to disease and pests because the field is mixed with multiple different species. If a particular disease or pest does come along, it's only going to affect one of the crops, not the entire field, because there's more than one plant planted on that field. And so it creates biodiversity. This is positive in the sense of lowering disease susceptibility, and it also creates more biodiversity, which creates habitats for other species. So, for example, the diversity of the crops attracts other types of species, like ducks that come into the paddies to eat the different pests that feed off of the rice. And so all these other species that get drawn into the rice-based polyculture also help to increase biodiversity, recycle nutrients back into the system, recycle waste, improve the overall health of the system. Other aspects of rice-based polyculture. It's artificial in the sense that it's constructed through human labor. This is artificially constructed. People have to build it and maintain this terracing. Give it a week or two without any human labor, and these amazing terraced hillsides will just turn into muddy hill slopes. It's also maximally specialized, meaning each aspect of the system, which you'll see more of in a minute, the timing of the irrigation, the timing of planting, the timing of moving the ducks off the paddies, the timing of weeding. It's all specialized and very specific and done at particular times to produce maximum possible output in terms of fertility and crop production. Also, these fields are continuously cultivated. So there's no fallow, they're continuously managed during each cycle of growth, whether that's planting or harvesting or fallow. There's always stuff going on the paddies related to maintaining the fertility, maintaining the system. And within this system, soil fertility here has been maintained, possibly even increased for thousands of years. One reason for this is because nutrients are continually being created and recycled back into the system just because of the way it's set up, right? Polyculture. And there's two keys to make this work. One, there has to be exact and extremely precise timing of irrigation, i.e. when people decide to water their field. One reason for this is that in Bali, all the water that's used to water the rice paddies is landlocked on the inside of the island. And that means there's only so much for everyone to irrigate with. If everyone irrigates at the exact same time, there's not enough water. And so they're organized into these different things called subaks, sort of collections of a number of households are organized into these subaks. And one subak will plant, then 2 weeks later, the next one downhill will plant, and so on. And then that first subak that planted first will irrigate, let the water into their fields. And a couple of weeks later, they will let that drain and let that water irrigate the next subaks down, and so on down the mountainside. And in this way, the way that irrigation is precisely timed and also staggered so that everyone's not watering at the same time, this is the only way to make sure there's enough water for all of the rice fields. So very precise timing of irrigation techniques, which ends up, as you'll see in a minute, being tied into the society's religion. And also lots and lots of labor is required to do this. Again, if you take the people out of the equation, these beautiful terraced hillsides will turn into a muddy slope in about a week or two. And so just to show you a little more about how this is done, you can see the rice-based terrace field on the slide. You have these tiny mud-diked flooded rice fields. So you see these sort of sections on the hillside that are terraced and then flooded, and the water's kept in by the dikes that they build. They can also grow crops on the dikes when the fields are flooded or when they're dry. Each year, the paddies have to be drained and rebuilt. So you have to, again, continually be managing this to keep it working. And it's also important to drain the paddies each year because of pest control, which we'll come back to here in a minute. The rice initially is planted in moist ground. Then once it grows to about a foot tall, the paddy has to be flooded, and then later it's drained for harvest. And so again, there's several of these mountainsides, several different subaks and households within each subak that need water to grow their crops. But if everyone waters at the same time, there won't be enough. So it has to be staggered. And that makes the control and timing of the water absolutely crucial. Within this system, over time, the fertility of the paddy has been either maintained or even increased. This is not true for industrial farming systems, right? We have to constantly add fertilizer to our system just to keep growing crops out of the degraded soil. Also, you can grow other crops like wheat or other things in the paddy when it's dry, or if the paddy is flooded, you can grow other crops on the dikes. Those sort of, you can see them in the picture, the dry areas on the field. And also fish live in the ponds and the canals. Ducks live near the paddies. So the fish and the ducks all eat pests. They also defecate into the water and the soil and also contribute further fertility to the soil. And other organic fertilizers are also added to these fields to increase fertility. One example is something called night soil. And for those of you that are not sure what night soil is human waste, human feces. And it's called night soil because in different Asian civilizations, in China, for example, there's a picture of a statue of a famous night soiler on the slide. People would come around to pick up human waste at night. So it was called night soil. And this can be really dangerous. Don't practice this at home. Using human waste to fertilize soil can be really dangerous because if not enough time goes by, disease-carrying parasites like parasitic worms will still be alive in the feces, and then this can infect and hurt people. And so it has to be buried underground. A lot of time has to pass in order for it to kill the dangerous parasites. But when you compost night soil properly, it creates fertile soil just teeming with beneficial micronutrients. And so this was also added to the fields to create even further fertility. And this is the reason that the fertility of the field has been not only maintained, but even increased over time. So some key attributes of this system: it's labor intensive. Again, you need people, you need warm bodies to get this done. It can't be done with machines and chemicals. With that said, it's highly, highly productive. So remember Bozarip talked about less people can actually be an impediment to environmental restoration. Bozarip said more people can actually be a good thing because it equals more hands, more minds, more knowledge, and therefore more innovation. And so in this case, rice-based polyculture, again, it can't be done without people. More people in this case is what has created a successful, fertile system that's highly, highly productive. So remember, there's two paths to agricultural intensification, growing more food. Hierarchy and centralization, as we've seen in the US and among the classic Maya, or small, self-sufficient households, as we see the Maya shifted to, and also in rice-based polyculture. But again, it requires high population densities and also specific environments. So to compare rice-based polyculture with U.S. industrial agriculture, rice-based polyculture is a form of intensive agriculture. So remember, there's two paths to producing more food: intensification, where on the same amount of land you put more effort into that plot of land to get more food out of it, and extensification. Instead of intensifying your efforts on the same plot of land, you extensify to get more food. You grow on more land, you spread out, you extensify. So intensification, put more effort onto the same plot of land to get more food. Extensification, spread out, plant more land to get more food. These are two different strategies. And so rice-based polyculture is intensive. You get very high yields of rice and other crops on a very small amount of land. This is possible because they maximize the productivity of the land by mimicking natural ecosystems. They use irrigation, terracing, night soil to get more food out of the same land. They intensify their efforts. This is in contrast to the U.S. agriculture, where we have extensified. Right? We grow more food by spreading out, at least initially. We get high yields on a large amount of land. Note the U.S. also now practices intensive agriculture. We use fertilizer, other chemical inputs to get more output out of that same unit of land. Rice-based polyculture is labor intensive. It takes someone working 50 days to cultivate 1 acre in this system. It requires people. In contrast, U.S. agriculture is mechanized. What takes one person 50 days to do in rice-based polyculture takes one person 2 to 3 hours to do per acre in U.S. ag. Remember, it's all riding tractors and spraying, as Pullen says. Rice-based polyculture is technologically simple. The farmers don't need to rely on scientists or Monsanto to buy their seed. It's simple digging sticks, plows, hoes, simple technology, but the farmers are highly skilled, highly knowledgeable about their local environment, and they know different special techniques for the timing of irrigation, for the planting of the rice, for the moving the ducks off the paddy at the right time. It's highly, highly intricate ecological knowledge of how it works in each field. This is in contrast to U.S. agriculture. It's technologically focused, not simple, right? So farmers can't really farm by themselves. They rely on companies and industries and scientists to tell them what seed to use, what chemicals to put on those seeds, their tractors, their machines, right? And this makes farmers essentially dependent on scientists, not just for technology, but even these days, just for the seed to grow our food. Most of it is patented. Rice-based polyculture. Farmers in this system are self-sufficient. They are growing for themselves, to feed their families, maybe to trade a little bit in the village. Their incentives are not to produce a bunch of food for sale on the market. This is in contrast to U.S. agriculture. The farmers aren't growing for their own livelihoods. They're not to eat, right? They're not growing their own food. They're growing for sale on the market, and it makes farmers reliant on markets, so that if what they're growing, say corn or soy, say the price on the market collapses, the farmer's totally screwed out of their livelihood. This is what happened in 2019 via the trade war that Trump started with China. China buys a ton of our farmers' soy. China said, you want to start a trade war? Okay, we're not going to buy any more of your soy. And Trump and his administration ended up spending $16 billion just on soy farmers to bail them out because no one in the market was buying soy. So it's a problem for the farmer. It's a problem for societies as a whole, right? If the incentives are to grow for the market, that's different than growing for yourself. And there's also, when you're growing for the market, there's an incentive to grow just as much as possible because that means more profit. That also usually means more environmental degradation. Lastly, in rice-based polyculture, they use energy inputs really efficiently. Think about the night soil, the irrigation. And we're going to watch a TED Talk and it shows how it works in Bali. So you'll actually see what I've been trying to explain to you. In contrast, industrial ag, extremely inefficient use of energy inputs. It takes anywhere from 8 to 12 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. Not because of human labor, but because of all the non-human energy inputs, the fossil fuels, the fertilizer, the herbicides, the pesticides, the chemicals. So in both cases, you can produce a lot of food for large populations. They're both reflective of complex societies, but on the one hand, one system is far more sustainable than the other. Also remember that the particular environment in which human populations develop influences the particular culture that they'll have. This is the materialist approach, right? The way in which people adapt to their environment via the material forces, the economy, subsistence, technology, economic relations. This will shape and drive the rest of the society. So in this vein, we can say all intensive agriculture, in a way, relies on a narrow set of species. For us, either corn or soy or wheat. In rice-based polyculture, they're growing more than just one monocrop, but it still is inherently less resilient than a naturally occurring ecosystem. We inherently simplify it because we're growing only the things we want, and it therefore makes it less resilient, less diversified. Right, that diversification, that redundancy that's built into natural ecosystems, there's not as much of that. So it makes them much less resilient than other forms of human subsistence, like Sweden had horticulture, slash and burn, or hunting and gathering, where, for example, like people among the Kung, hunter-gatherers, they're not really modifying their environment at all. They're simply living off of what it provides. And so there's a trade-off. We've made our environments less resilient, our systems less resilient through relying on intensive agriculture. But the trade-off is we can produce more food. We can support more people. We can increase carrying capacity, at least for now. And so remember the materialist approach that I just mentioned, these specific adaptations developed in response to the environment. Rice-based polyculture developed where land was really scarce. There wasn't room to spread out, but labor was cheap. And so you intensify. You use the same plot of land, but put more labor, more effort into it to get more food. In the US, agriculture developed where land was cheap, namely because we stole and appropriated most of it for ourselves from the Native Americans. Land was cheap and labor was expensive. People's wages were high. And so instead of hiring a lot of people to farm in the same area, you spread out. You use a lot of land and not a lot of people to grow a bunch of food. So two different paths to growing more food, right? Intensification and extensification, both inherently simplify the ecosystem. And so the reason we're talking about rice-based polyculture in Indonesia is to show you an example of another way, an example of resource management, of farming that doesn't necessarily result in environmental degradation, but can still support a large number of people. There was a film made about rice-based polyculture in Bali, Indonesia in 1988 called The Goddess and the Computer. And I used to show the film in class. I don't anymore because it's just sort of out of date and degraded. But if you're interested, here's the links. And what the film is about this system, rice-based polyculture, and how the whole system is predicated on the people's religion, which is related to the water goddess and the water temple. So as I was saying, water is landlocked in Bali. And so the only way to make sure everyone has enough water is to stagger the timing of the irrigation so that the fields on top irrigate first. The fields or the subecs below wait a few weeks, then they irrigate. The fields below them wait a few weeks, then they irrigate. And in this way, in which irrigation is staggered, there's enough water for everyone. Also, if you irrigate all the fields at the same time and grow the rice in the same stage all at the same time, it's really easy for pests and diseases to attack your crop. So also by staggering the irrigation and the timing of the growth of each field, it also helps to control for pest infestations. There's all these benefits that come from the way in which the farming system is tied into the religion. And so each subak is organized around the water temple and the water goddess. That's what determines the timing of when the water is released. And again, it's released differently down the hill in a staggered order so that there's enough water for everyone. What happens in Goddess and the Computer is Steve Lansing, an anthropologist and also an ecologist, are trying to build a computer simulation, a model to show the Balinese government how important the religion, the subak system, which controls the timing of the irrigation, how important that religion is to the farming system in Bali. What had happened at this time is the Green Revolution had been exported into Bali, and the way they sell it is here. Grow these seeds, use these chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and you'll be able to grow way more food. You'll be able to sell that on the market. This will increase your economic well-being. This will make everyone in Bali more well-off, right? Create economic development and profit, and that will trickle down and help the whole society. And so they do. They import the Green Revolution to Bali, and what it does is it totally destroys the system. They already don't need fertilizer because the soil is already fertile. So when they start dumping fertilizer on their fields, it doesn't get absorbed by the plants. It runs off into the freshwater and eventually the oceans, creating these hypoxic dead zones that essentially are killing the coral reef systems and the marine ecosystems off the coast of Bali. They're just dead, dying, still happening, even though people have tried to reverse the damage the Green Revolution has done. And so this computer model was developed to try to show government officials and scientists and outside experts involved in exporting the Green Revolution to Bali that the religion is key, and to ignore it is to the detriment of the whole system. So what we're going to do is we're not going to watch the film The Goddess and the Computer. But we are going to watch a TED Talk by Stephen Lansing, who was in the Goddess and the Computer film. And he's the anthropologist that went over there and sort of did some of this stuff. So we're going to watch this TED Talk, and Steve Lansing is going to tell you about this subak system in rice-based polyculture in Indonesia. So what you're going to do, go ahead and pause the lecture and watch the 15-minute TED. And then after you've watched the TED Talk, go ahead and come back and join me for the last few minutes of lecture. Okay, so hopefully you watched the TED Talk. And so you can see some of the consequences of the importation of the Green Revolution into Bali. The system was already sustainable. The soil was already fertile. They didn't need fertilizer. The addition of the fertilizer actually degraded and destroyed entire parts of their ecosystem. The traditional system actually worked quite better, but the damage had already been done, right? The Green Revolution had already been imported. And you have farmers that are still dumping fertilizer on their fields, even though they've been told they don't need to. And that fertilizer is not being absorbed by the plants. It has to go somewhere. It ends up going into the freshwater systems, eutrophying our marine ecosystems, creating toxic algae blooms, and destroying all other marine life in those zones. So important takeaways from the TED Talk and the example of Bali. In this case, the importation of the Green Revolution, Western scientists brought a huge bias with them. They essentially came in, imposed their own Western development schemes to the detriment of the local system, right? They assumed religion, the water goddess, the water temples, was not an important component of the farming system, and yet it's absolutely essential. It's key to the timing of irrigation, which is what the whole system is predicated on. This is what we call paternalism. Outsiders, typically powerful Westerners, come in to other cultures, typically non-Western, less powerful ones, and impose their own concepts, their own ideas of what these people need and should do, and then put it into practice in their projects. The result is often a lot of wasted effort, a lot of wasted resources, and a lot of failed projects that don't actually help the beneficiaries that they set out to help. It highlights the importance of holism in anthropology. Right? Anthropology emphasizes we have to understand how the parts are interrelated. How do the parts form the whole? You cannot look at just one part, say farming, without understanding and considering how it's interrelated to the other parts. Say in this case, religion, right? The parts are all interrelated, and we have to understand this if we're to actually understand what's going on. Think about it. If you're trying to understand how a car works, what do you look at? Do you look at the wheels, which seem to be important? Do you look at the steering wheel? Do you look at the frame? Do you look at the engine? And not any single one of those would answer your question. You have to look at all the parts and how they fit together to understand how the whole system works. And so development, what we saw in the TED Talk and the failed importation of the Green Revolution, this highlights a lot of problems with development and conservation and aid projects that are imposed often by outsiders. It's what we call top-down versus bottom-up planning. So a team of outsiders, scientists, economic experts, development planners will develop aid or conservation or economic development projects and then try to implement them in other places. This is called top-down planning. The planning comes from the top and is implemented downwards onto the community. This is really problematic. It doesn't take into account the local knowledge or needs or desires of the local community. Maybe you're trying to import a project that people don't even want. Or maybe you're importing the Green Revolution with this idea that, oh, this will help these people, and it completely destroys their ecosystem and their farming system. Top-down planning is prevalent, but extremely problematic. They always carry this bias. In top-down planning, there's a bias towards Western scientific thought, that science sort of has all the answers, and whatever you're doing, we can do it better, right? Paternalism, we know best. Or this assumption, for example, that how could religion possibly be related to rice production or irrigation in Bali? It is. It's incredibly interrelated. So this lack of knowledge of local context or the failure to try to understand local sociocultural context results in many failed or only partially successful projects. In the film, The Goddess in the Computer, that we didn't watch, there's an example of outside planners talking about, well, we don't want to hire an anthropologist to come in and see what the people might need or what the local context is all about, because that's expensive. Well, the multi-million-dollar dam they built in part of their Green Revolution project was also very expensive. And it also didn't help the people. It made things worse off. So a lot of people would argue, have an anthropologist as an advocate or a liaison or someone to go in and do the groundwork to actually talk to the people that are supposedly supposed to benefit from these projects, because a lot of times they don't, and it leaves them frustrated and even further disenfranchised. Development projects and aid projects, they're often well-intentioned, but they don't have a holistic perspective, and they result in a lot of failed, wasted resources and effort. So just a couple examples from my own work. On the slide here, that gentleman's name is Sam, and that's a picture from Titiana and Solomon Islands. And so there was different NGOs on all the different islands, and the NGO that worked on Gizo was Oxfam. And so Oxfam came in, and their whole plan was to rebuild housing. And I interviewed the main project guy for Oxfam on Gizo, really nice guy, he was a construction guy. And I said, well, how did you guys know to build houses for people? And his answer was, well, we just knew. We could tell that's what they needed. We knew. No elaboration, never asked a single person what they wanted or what they needed. They just knew. Also, because of some failures of Oxfam's initial project, the story is more complicated than I'm going to tell you here. They ended up, instead of rebuilding houses for people in Titiana and Pailonggue and on Gizo, there's like 14, 15 villages on the island, they, instead of rebuilding because they didn't have enough, they gave people partial building materials. And then the idea was, take these and you can rebuild your own house. It was called an empowerment plan, right? Not only give people the resources to rebuild, but let them do it themselves. It will empower them. They can feel good about themselves. What a lovely fucking idea. That sounds great on paper. Probably got a bunch of funding from outsiders. How many of you know how to build a fucking house? Yeah, me neither. And a lot of people in Titiana and Pailonggue also didn't know how to build a house. And so you end up with these partial building materials. Many people couldn't even use them because they didn't know how to build. Sam actually kind of did know how to build. This is what he started with the materials he was given. But eventually he had to abandon that. It still looks like that today because the wood Oxfam gave him was completely rotten. It was already rotted. It couldn't be used to build a house. Another example, there was a Signola, this man, Titiana villager I was interviewing one day. And also, being a white girl walking around Solomon Islands, a lot of people think that I'm an NGO worker, which I was not. I'm an anthropologist. And so I kind of have to explain that. But they still kind of think I know about like the aid they got and what else might be coming. So I get a lot of questions about that. And Signola, I was interviewing him. And he asked me, he said, kind of got on, why did the NGOs do this or that? And I do my best to explain, but again, that's not, I wasn't part of the NGOs. I wouldn't have done it that way. And he says, they gave us spoons. One of the things that the NGOs replaced, because everyone lost everything, it was just completely washed away, was like kitchen utensils and cups, right? They're just replacing stuff. But they weren't asking people what they needed. They were just deciding, oh, here's kitchen utensils. You lost them, so you obviously need more. And Signola asked me, said, why did they give us spoons? I can't feed my family with a spoon. And I love sort of the double entendre of that. I can't feed my family with a spoon. Why didn't they ask us what we wanted? I can feed my family with a canoe. He said, I can go out, I can take that canoe, I can go fishing, I can feed my family the fish, I can take some of that fish and sell it in the market and buy some rice. I said, I can't feed my family with a spoon, I can feed my family with a canoe. I can build my house with a canoe. I can't build my house with a spoon. With a canoe, I can go out, fish. After I feed my family, I can sell some of that fish in the market for a little bit of corrugated iron, a little bit of timber. I can slowly rebuild my house with that. I can rebuild my house with a canoe. I can feed my family with a canoe. I can't do that with a spoon. Why didn't they ask us what we needed, what we wanted? And this is a common pitfall of Western imposed development aid and conservation projects. Powerful outsiders come in, impose their own paternalistic ideas of what people need, and they're often wrong. And it results in all this wasted effort and really, really frustrated locals that continually are told and think help is coming, and it never, ever comes. There was another example, one other example from Solomon Islands. In Pailonggue, the other main village I worked in, the Papua New Guinea Salvation Army, so the Salvation Army, but based in Papua New Guinea, donated 15 wooden houses with labor included. This is like the Ritz-Carlton of the village, like wooden house with a rain tank with labor included. That's a fucking mansion. And they donate, so they built 15 houses with labor on the hill in Pailongue village, one for each household in this small enclave of the village. Do you know how many people are living there now? Almost none. Because Pailongue villagers don't live on the hill. It takes about a half hour to climb up the hill by digging your big toe into the muddy hillside and hoping it doesn't slip back out. By the time to go get water, you got to go down the hill and back up. 45 minutes later, you've dropped most of the water you went to carry. You're covered in mud. It's difficult. People fish, they garden. They don't do this on the hill. They do it down by the seaside. And so they do not live on the hill. It'd be kind of like me offering you go to school at SDSU. Cool. Well, hey, I got you a 1-bedroom apartment in Orange County. Great, but I can't fucking use it. And so the NGO, the Salvation Army, came in and said their whole plan, their whole paternalistic idea was, oh, well, we're going to build back better. And so we're not going to rebuild their houses by the sea where they live. We're going to build them on top of the hill so that if a tsunami ever happens again, it won't wipe out the village. Well, guess what? No one lives up there because that's not where they live. NGOs, outsiders come in with good intentions most of the time, but they do not actually help most of the time. So much wasted effort and resources because people don't bother to find out the local social context they're working in, and they don't bother to ask people, the beneficiaries of their project, what they actually want and need, right? They assume that they know. Top-down planning. It's a non-holistic perspective, and it's extremely problematic, results in a lot of wasted resources. One other thing I'll say, you started reading this book, Nature and Culture at Lake Titicaca, Lines in the Water, by Ben Orlove. And so stick with it. It's not a textbook. It's an ethnography. It's a story about the fishing villages, an ethnographic story about the fishing villages around Lake Titicaca. The reason we're reading it is it's a really great example of an alternative to sort of top-down, externally imposed resource management policies and schemes. In the book, it's an example of what we call community-based resource management, in which control over the resources, over the environment, is actually maintained by the local resource users rather than the government or scientists or outside economic powers. The locals actually retain control, and in the face of a lot of external pressures, other powerful actors, the government, the military, powerful commercial interests coming in, trying to wrestle control of the resources from the villagers. And so it's a cool, unique example of long-term sustainable resource use that's been maintained in the face of change over the last several decades, last couple centuries. It's an alternative to top-down conservation policy, again, called community-based resource management. So with that, I hope you all have a fantastic day, and our next topic is continuing in this thread of sustainability across cultures and through time, but we'll be moving away from complex societies into horticultural societies in the Amazon on Thursday. So we'll look at another example and what can we learn from them, if anything. All right, have a great day. See ya.